Hello everyone, welcome to the fire safety video discussion. In this video discussion, we're going to be going over the fire safety video that you just saw, and we're also going to talk about some specifics in regards to how to react to emergency situations when you're on the clock working as an HCA. Let's begin. Let's start off by talking about some statistics to kind of get a better idea of how big of an issue fire safety is and how important fire safety is, especially for the older age population. So let's cover some residential fire statistics, or fires that happen in people's homes. Let's talk about those statistics. Now, records show that there are more than 400,000 house fires that occur in the United States alone every year. Now, most residential fires are linked to being caused by those who live there. So most of these fires that are happening in people's homes are usually caused or linked by those individuals that live in that particular home. Now, this is because these fires are seen as a result of carelessness, lack of knowledge, and improper response to when a fire starts. Now, when we're talking specifically about the population that you are going to be working with, so older aged individuals, people that are aged 60 years and older are twice as likely to die in a fire than the national average, and people who are aged 85 years and older are 4 times as likely to die in a fire than the national average. Now, we're going to talk specifically about why that might be and ways to prevent this sort of incident from happening. So now let's cover and talk about why that statistic is so high for individuals that are age 65 and older. So we're going to be talking about aging and the vulnerability to fire emergencies that come with aging. Now, as I've mentioned before, aging can cause older adults to be more vulnerable to fires. This is because the effects of aging cause a decline in senses and physical functioning. So essentially, older aged individuals may be more susceptible to injury due to a fire-related emergency because they may not be able to hear the smoke alarm, they may not be able to smell smoke or gasoline, they may not be able to escape from a fire due to a physical decline or poor eyesight, and they may not be able to make critical decisions because of illnesses such as dementia or because of their high-powered medications that they may be taking due to severe illnesses in older age. Now let's talk about your role as an HCA in terms to fire safety situations. Now, as an HCA, your role in terms of fire safety is to help reduce the risk of injury or death for both you and your client. Now, this can be done multiple different ways. This can be done through understanding what makes a fire, identifying and correcting fire hazards in your home, and knowing what to do when a fire first starts. As you may have recalled, most of the residential fires that we talked about were caused because of lack of knowledge and lack of a proper response to when a fire first starts. This is why it's so important for us to go over these topics, which we will in this presentation. So let's start our discussion by talking about what exactly makes a fire. So by knowing the components that come together in order to create a fire, you can better understand how to prevent this kind of situation from happening. Now, as I just said, there are multiple components needed in order for a fire to start. Specifically, there's 4 separate components. The first of which is oxygen. Now, oxygen is something that is present already in the air around us. The second component is fuel. Now, this fuel is whatever material is being burned in the fire, whether that be paper, wood, upholstery, gasoline, some blinds, whatever the material is that is burning up while the fire is running. The third component is heat. Now, this heat primarily comes from stoves, fireplaces, cigarettes, or some electrical wiring, etc. There's multiple different things that can be this heat source. And the last component in order for a fire to start is this rapid chemical chain reaction. Now, this chain reaction happens when those 3 components come together. So when this oxygen, a source of fuel, and heat all combine together, there's a chemical chain reaction that happens that causes that fire to start. Now, one of the most important tools that should be in every home are smoke alarms. Smoke alarms help to indicate to us that there is a fire forming or that a fire has already started. Now, it's very important to have these smoke alarms. Let's talk about why. Now, according to the U.S. Fire Administration, 75% of older Americans that have died to a house fire did not have working smoke alarms. Most of these house fires occurred at night, and they were due to factors such as smoke, toxic gas, or lack of oxygen. Now, it's important to note that just the smell of smoke or gasoline will not wake an individual up that has fallen asleep. This is why smoke alarms are so important, especially if the fire occurs at night while we are asleep. When the smoke alarm goes off, we're able to hear it and it can wake us up from our sleep and indicate to us that there is an emergency going on. Because as I just mentioned, it's not necessary that we will smell the smoke when we are asleep. This is why it's very critical that there are smoke alarms in every home, especially in your client's home. If your client does not have a smoke alarm, you can always encourage them to get a smoke alarm. And, if they're still not able to get that smoke alarm, that's something you can report to your supervisor so that your supervisor can reach out to the case manager and talk about whether or not a smoke alarm can be provided for the client. These kind of situations are things that need to be reported to your supervisor. Another thing that you can report to your supervisor is if your client does not have a first aid kit in their home. That is also an essential that needs to be in every home. Now that we've talked about the importance of smoke alarms, let's talk about where smoke alarms should be located in every home. So, smoke alarms should be placed near bedrooms and near the kitchen. Now, the reason for this is, as I mentioned, especially if a fire were to occur at nighttime, you need to ensure that you're able to hear that smoke alarm go off. That's why it's important that it be placed near your bedroom. Now, the reason it's important for it to be placed near the kitchen is that most daytime fires are caused due to incidents that happen in the kitchen. This is because there's a lot of heat sources in the kitchen. There's a stove and an oven, so it's more likely for a fire to start in the kitchen than anywhere else in the house. Now, if you're mounting a smoke alarm onto the ceiling, make sure that it is centered or that it's at least 4 inches away from the nearest wall. Now, if you're mounting a smoke alarm onto the wall, make sure that it is at least 6 to 12 inches away from the ceiling. Now, continuing talking about where to locate smoke alarms in your home, smoke alarms should be located away from air vents, away from windows, and away from doors. So essentially, you want to place your smoke alarms away from anywhere where there may be a draft that can interfere with your alarm's operation. Now, smoke alarms should be tested monthly, and the batteries should be replaced twice a year. Most smoke alarms have a battery life or a working life of about 10 years, so smoke alarms need to be changed after every 10 years. But the batteries that go into the smoke alarm should be checked twice a year and replaced if needed. Now let's talk about the case if a fire were to take place. So if you are at your client's home and you smell smoke, or if you see smoke, or if you suspect that there is a fire that has started, it is important for you to call for help right away. So as I mentioned, if there is a fire or if you suspect that there is a fire, call 911 right away. Now, the client's individualized emergency backup plan should always be placed somewhere that is easily visible. So a good place to place this backup plan would be on the fridge. Now, just as a refresher, this individualized emergency backup plan includes important contact information in regards to who to call in emergency situations, and it also has the client's emergency contact information on there. This is why it's very important that it is placed somewhere visible so that in case of an emergency, both you and the client can quickly look at this backup plan and know exactly who to call and what numbers to dial. Now, once you and your client have safely exited the building and the emergency personnel have arrived at the scene, you must report the incident to your supervisor. Any emergency situation or any situation in which 911 is called, or for example, if your client has a fall or is injured in any way, must be reported to your supervisor. Now, even if there is a fire and 911 is called, but no one is sent to the hospital, this is still something that needs to be reported to your supervisor. Also, it's very important to make sure that you call 911 if you suspect that there is a fire, even if you just smell smoke and you don't see a physical fire. It's better to call 911 and make sure that the emergency personnel reach the scene. That is much better to do than to risk any injuries or any damages due to a house fire. Now, in the case of an emergency fire situation, it's important that you have an escape route planned ahead of time. So as I just said, you should always have an escape route planned out beforehand in case of an emergency. Now, in the case of a fire emergency, your first priority is to get yourself as well as your client out of the home and away from the fire. Now, be sure that you always rehearse your escape plan. In your escape plan, you should always identify at least 2 exit routes out of each room in the home and identify the easiest and fastest way to get out of the home so that both you and your client know exactly what to do in case of a fire emergency. Now let's talk about how to extinguish a fire. Fire extinguishers should be placed at each level of the home. Now when using a fire extinguisher, remember the PATH model. P stands for pull the pin, A stands for aim the nozzle, S for squeeze, and the second S stands for sweep the base of the fire. Now after using the extinguisher, even if you believe that the fire is completely out, it's very important to call 911 and have emergency personnel check the scene. Now, in case you or your client were to catch on fire, the best thing to do is to stop, drop, and roll. So you may have heard this saying, it's a very common saying, and it's used to help remember how to put out a fire that may have caught on to you or your client. Now, in these situations, a blanket can also be used to pat down someone else who may be on fire. Now, for clients that are bedbound, utilize the wrap and slide model. So use a blanket to wrap the individual up, and while supporting their head and shoulders, slide them towards the nearest exit. Now let's talk about how to leave a burning building that is filled up with smoke. So if you're stuck in a building filled with smoke, the best way to exit is to drop to your knees and crawl to the nearest door or window. Now crawling is effective in this situation as there is less smoke and heat the closer you get to floor level. Now once you've reached that door or window, be sure to first feel the temperature. If it's hot, do not open the door, as there is most likely smoke or fire behind the door. If it's cool, then brace your shoulder against the door and open it gently. Also, be sure to close the door completely behind you to ensure that you are preventing the spread of the fire. Now, you may recall that we mentioned that most daytime fires are caused from incidences in the kitchen. This is why it's very important to go over some kitchen safety. Now, using the oven or the stove as a heat source can be very dangerous. Also, be sure not to store flammable items such as paper towels in the oven. And never pour water on a grease fire. Now, if there is a fire that starts in a pan on the stove, do not lift the pan off the stove. While keeping the pan still on the stove, place the lid over it before you lower the flame. Never leave cooking unattended, and avoid wearing clothing with dangly sleeves when you are cooking, as that can be a fire hazard. Now let's talk about some bedroom safety. Do not place anything on top of an electric blanket, never sleep while using a heating pad, and be sure to close the bedroom door when you go to bed, as this can help to prevent the spread of a fire if one were to start. Let's end off by talking about some appliance safety. Appliances that are not being used should always be unplugged. And when you are using an appliance, be sure to insert the plug fully before you power the appliance on. Do not ever try to fix an appliance yourself. And if you see smoke or notice smell coming from an appliance, be sure to unplug it immediately. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to utilize all of these fire safety tips in case of a fire and to help prevent a fire emergency from occurring. Always remember to call 911 if you ever suspect that there is a fire. And also be sure to call the client's emergency backup contact, as well as your supervisor in the case of any form of emergency. It's very important to let your supervisor know of any emergencies or any changes in the client's home, and it's very important to let your client's emergency contact know of these emergency situations. Thank you so much for listening.